A Boeing 777 carrying 367 passengers was crossing the Atlantic on what seemed like a routine flight when an unexpected storm turned the cockpit into a nightmare. At 39,000 feet, the controls began freezing one by one, and what appeared to be a safe route became a desperate race against time. With systems failing and the aircraft losing stability, the captain had to make decisions that would either save hundreds of lives or condemn them to the frozen ocean below. Have you ever imagined being in command of an aircraft with nearly 400 people on board and suddenly realizing you're losing control? That every command you give seems to have no effect? Well, that's exactly what happened to me that night over the Atlantic, and what I experienced in those hours forever changed the way I see aviation, life, and how vulnerable we are up there, even with all the technology in the world. Stay with me until the end, because this story will make you understand the true meaning of the word emergency. It was an October night, and I was commanding a Boeing 777-300ER carrying 367 passengers and a crew of 18. The route was long, crossing the Atlantic toward Europe, and everything had started as just another routine flight. Boarding was smooth, pre-flight checks showed no abnormalities, and takeoff happened as expected. Beside me was First Officer Mike, an experienced professional with over 15 years in commercial aviation. In the back of the cabin, the flight attendant team was already starting the in-flight service, while most passengers settled in for a long night of flying. I had over 20 years of experience in commercial aviation, had flown in adverse conditions countless times, from severe turbulence to mechanical failures. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what was coming. The route we were following was one of the busiest in the world, and that night the sky seemed to be on our side. Stars shone through the windshield, and the green lights of the navigation instruments blinked rhythmically, indicating everything was working perfectly. We chatted about small things. Mike commented on the vacation he was planning to take the following month, and I thought about how good it would be to get home after this trip. Cruise altitude was 39,000 feet, and the plane flew smoothly, almost as if gliding over a glass surface. Down below, the Atlantic Ocean stretched out like a vast desert of darkness, without a single light to break the monotony. It was the kind of flight every pilot appreciates. No surprises, no complications. But I should have known that in aviation, calm is often just the prelude to something much bigger. We were about 3 hours into the flight when air traffic control alerted us about a storm formation developing ahead of us. It wasn't completely unexpected. Storms over the Atlantic are relatively common, especially at that time of year. The onboard weather radar began showing areas of intense precipitation, with convective cells forming rapidly. Mike and I analyzed the images carefully, plotting an alternate route that would allow us to avoid the most dangerous areas. We requested a change in altitude and course from control, and authorization came almost immediately. We climbed to 41,000 feet, seeking to stay above the densest clouds. For a few minutes it seemed we'd made the right decision. Turbulence was light, nothing that caused concern. Passengers were still relatively calm, some sleeping, others watching movies on individual monitors. But then, almost without warning, we entered a completely different air mass. The outside temperature, which was around 55 degrees Celsius, dropped even further. Ice warnings began flashing on the panel, and I felt the aircraft starting to respond strangely to commands. It was as if there was a delay between what I did with the yoke and what the plane executed. Mike noticed it too. "You feeling this?" he asked, his voice slightly tense. "Yeah," I replied, my eyes quickly scanning the instruments. "Let's activate the full anti-ice system." We activated all available de-icing systems, wings, engines, sensors. The procedures were clear, and we'd both executed them dozens of times in training and real situations. But this time something was different. Ice formation was happening at an alarming rate, much faster than anything I'd ever seen. And then the first major problem appeared. The autopilot disengaged, an audible alarm filled the cabin, and warning lights began flashing on the panel. "Autopilot disconnected," announced the system's synthesized voice. Immediately I took manual control. The aircraft was heavy, the controls stiff. It was like trying to drive a car with tires stuck in mud. Each movement of the yoke required much more effort than normal. "Mike, check the airspeed sensors," I ordered. He began verifying the instruments, and what we saw made us swallow hard. The three independent airspeed measurement systems were showing completely different readings. One indicated we were flying too fast, almost near maximum operational speed. Another suggested we were dangerously slow, near stall speed. The third oscillated between the two extremes. "The Pitot tubes are frozen," Mike said, his voice now clearly worried. "All of them." This was critical. Pitot tubes are sensors that measure air pressure to calculate aircraft speed. Without reliable speed readings, we were essentially flying blind. We didn't know if we were too fast or too slow, and any wrong decision could lead to catastrophe. I had to trust my experience, my instincts, and the few instruments that were still working correctly. I kept the aircraft's attitude, the angle relative to the horizon, constant and adjusted engine power based on expected performance for that altitude and weight. It was manual flying in its purest and most dangerous form, but the problems kept piling up. The altimeter began showing erratic readings, going up and down without any actual change in our altitude. The artificial horizon, one of the most reliable instruments in the cockpit, began flickering intermittently. And then the inertial navigation system started showing signs of failure. We were losing references one by one, as if the aircraft itself was being shut down bit by bit. Turbulence intensified. The plane was shaken violently, climbing and descending hundreds of feet in seconds. I could hear passengers screaming through the cockpit door, and knew that back there things were getting scary. I requested that flight attendants ensure everyone had their seatbelts fastened, and that they themselves be seated. There was no more in-flight service, no more tranquility. Now it was a matter of survival. Mike was trying to establish constant communication with air traffic control, but even that was becoming difficult. Static took over the radio frequencies, and control responses came fragmented. We declared an emergency situation and requested immediate descent to a lower altitude, where the air would be less cold and conditions, we hoped, somewhat better. Authorization came, but descending also had its risks. Descending too fast could increase speed beyond safe limits, but descending too slowly could keep the aircraft in the icing zone too long. I had to find the perfect balance. I gradually reduced engine power and pushed the yoke forward, initiating a controlled descent. The aircraft responded, but lethargically. It was as if it was fighting me, resisting every command. Ice on the wings was completely altering the aircraft's aerodynamics, reducing lift and increasing drag. Every passing second, we felt the plane getting heavier, harder to control. During the descent, we passed through an especially dense cloud layer. Visibility dropped to zero, and all we could see through the window was a white and grey wall illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning around us. It was claustrophobic, disorienting. Even with years of training, it's hard not to feel a knot in your chest when you're in that situation. And then, something I'd never experienced before, we began to feel the controls locking up. Literally locking up. The yoke, which I held firmly, began offering more and more resistance. It was as if someone was on the other side, pulling in the opposite direction. I tried moving the rudder pedals, and they too were rigid, almost impossible to move. "Mike, the controls are freezing," I said, my voice louder than intended. He looked at me, eyes wide. "That's not possible. The hydraulic systems have heating, they're redundant." "I know what it should be, but I'm telling you what's happening," I replied. "Help me here." Together we began forcing the controls, using all our physical strength to move the yoke and pedals. It was exhausting. Each movement required tremendous effort. My hands were sweating inside the gloves, and I could feel my back starting to ache with the tension. But we couldn't stop. If we lost complete control of the aircraft, there would be no way back. With 367 passengers counting on us, giving up simply wasn't an option. We continued the descent, each 1,000 feet seeming like an eternity. Altitude went from 41,000 to 38,000, then 35,000, 32,000. We were still inside the clouds, still surrounded by the storm. Lightning was now more frequent, illuminating the cabin with white and bluish flashes that left spots in my vision. The noise of wind and rain against the windshield was deafening, competing with alarms that wouldn't stop sounding. At one point, I felt the aircraft starting to bank left. It was a subtle bank at first, but began increasing rapidly. I tried to correct with the yoke, but the response was minimal. The plane kept rolling, and the artificial horizon, when it worked, showed we were dangerously banked. If we didn't correct soon, we'd enter a spiral, and at this altitude, with compromised controls, there would be no recovery. "Asymmetric power!" Mike shouted. "Left engine is losing thrust." He was right. The left engine, probably due to ice accumulation or some failure induced by extreme conditions, was delivering less power than the right. This created an imbalance that pulled the aircraft to the side. Quickly, I increased power on the right engine, trying to compensate, but the still locked controls made correction almost impossible. I used all my strength on the yoke and pedals, and slowly, very slowly, the aircraft began to level out. Minutes later, we finally emerged from the densest cloud layer. Visibility improved slightly, and I could see the ocean below, occasionally illuminated by lightning strikes. We were now at 28,000 feet, and the outside temperature had risen to 40 degrees Celsius. Still extremely cold, but enough for the ice to slowly begin melting. The controls started responding better. They weren't perfect, far from it, but at least I could move them without having to use brute force. Systems began coming back online, one by one. First, the altimeter stabilized, then the artificial horizon stopped flickering. The Pitot tubes, as ice melted, began providing more consistent readings. That was the most critical moment of my entire career. We were at 28,000 feet, with partially recovered but still unstable controls, one engine operating below capacity, and over 300 people trusting every decision I made. I knew we couldn't continue like this. We needed to land as soon as possible, but we were in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from any airport. Mike was already working on it, calculating distance to the nearest diversion airports. "We've got 3 options," he said, showing me the navigation map. "Azores is 280 miles south, but we'll have to go through more storms to get there. Iceland is 320 miles north, outside the storm area, but with strong winds. And Ireland is 420 miles east, the longest route, but potentially the safest." I analyzed the options quickly. Azores would be fastest, but would mean more time in the storm with compromised systems. Iceland was tempting for being outside the bad weather area, but strong winds and runway conditions at that time of year could complicate landing. Ireland was the longest route, but with better airport infrastructure and better equipped emergency teams. Ireland, I decided, request maximum priority and alert emergency services. We are going to need everything they've got. Mike immediately began transmitting our intention to air traffic control. The response was quick and professional. All other aircraft were diverted from our route, and airports along the way were put on alert. We turned the aircraft east, and I began calculating if we'd have enough fuel. With the left engine operating at reduced capacity, consumption was higher than normal. We'd make it, but with little margin for error. Any additional delay, any new problem, and we'd have to consider an emergency ocean landing. I didn't even want to think about that possibility. While flying toward Ireland, I took advantage of a moment of relative calm to communicate with passengers. I picked up the intercom and, trying to keep my voice as firm and calm as possible, explained that we were facing adverse weather conditions and technical problems, but that we had everything under control and would land soon at an alternate airport. I didn't mention the full severity of the situation. There was no need to cause panic, but I wanted them to know we were handling this professionally. After hanging up the intercom, Mike looked at me. "Think we're gonna make it?" he asked, voice low. It was a question no pilot wants to ask, but sometimes needs to be asked. I looked at him, then at the instruments, and then at the darkness beyond the windshield. "Yes," I replied with conviction. "We're gonna make it, because we don't have another option." The next 50 minutes were the longest of my life. Each system that came back online was a small victory, but each new alarm or warning light was a reminder that we still weren't safe. The left engine continued with reduced performance, forcing me to make constant adjustments to the controls to keep the aircraft level. Turbulence, though less severe than before, still shook the plane periodically, testing my ability to maintain control. Mike maintained constant communication with Irish control, updating our position and status. They already had emergency teams positioned, ambulances, fire trucks, everything ready for any eventuality. Knowing there was an entire network of professionals working to help us provided some comfort, but also reinforced the gravity of the situation. When we finally spotted the lights of the Irish coast, I felt a wave of relief, but knew it still wasn't over. The landing would be challenging. With one engine operating below capacity, controls still not fully responsive, and after hours of flight under extreme stress, Mike and I were mentally and physically exhausted. But we had to focus. This was the final moment, the ultimate test of everything we'd learned throughout our careers. We initiated the airport approach. The controller guided us precisely, clearing the airspace completely. We were the only aircraft in the sky at that moment over Ireland. Visibility was reasonable, wind was within acceptable limits. We configured the aircraft for landing, lowering flaps and landing gear. Each action was accompanied by cross-checks, ensuring everything was working as it should. When the runway lights appeared ahead, aligned perfectly with the aircraft's nose, I felt a mixture of hope and determination. 500 feet, Mike announced, monitoring altitude. 400, 300, 200, 100. I reduced engine power and raised the aircraft's nose slightly, preparing for touchdown. Crosswind pushed the plane slightly to the side, and I corrected with pedals and yoke. And then we felt the touchdown. The main wheels touched the runway with a firm but controlled impact. I engaged the reversers, and the aircraft began to decelerate. Emergency vehicle lights were positioned along the runway following our path. When we finally came to a complete stop at the end of the runway, I shut down the engines and allowed myself for the first time in hours to breathe deeply. We'd done it. All 367 passengers, the 18 crew members, and the 2 of us in the cockpit were safe on solid ground. The silence in the cockpit was broken by the sound of applause coming from the back of the aircraft. The passengers, who had just lived through one of the scariest experiences of their lives, were applauding. Applauding the crew, applauding the fact they were alive, applauding because, against all odds, we'd managed to bring them back safely. Mike and I looked at each other, and no words were necessary. What we'd shared in those last hours created a bond that few experiences can equal. Emergency teams boarded quickly, checking for injuries. Fortunately, besides some passengers with elevated anxiety and a few minor injuries caused by turbulence, nothing serious, everyone was fine. We pilots were evaluated too. I was exhausted, hands trembling slightly due to adrenaline discharge, but I was okay. In the following hours, investigation into what had happened began. Technical teams examined the aircraft meticulously. Ice accumulation had been exceptional, far beyond what anti-ice systems were designed to handle. Weather conditions that night were a rare combination of factors that created a particularly dangerous storm for aviation. The Pitot tubes, despite having heating, had frozen due to the intensity of ice formed. The hydraulic systems of flight controls, though redundant and protected, had been affected by a combination of extreme low temperatures and ice in areas not anticipated by aircraft designers. It was such a rare event that engineers classified it as a perfect storm of adverse conditions. The preliminary report praised our performance, highlighting that decisions made, from declaring emergency, choosing the diversion airport, to manual control of the aircraft under extreme conditions, were fundamental in preventing a tragedy. But for me, it wasn't just about following procedures. It was about trusting experience, staying calm when everything seemed to be falling apart, and never, not for a second, considering the possibility of giving up. In the following days, I had time to reflect on everything that happened. I talked with some passengers who stayed at the airport waiting for connecting flights. Many came to thank me personally, some with tears in their eyes, others simply wanting to shake my hand. An elderly woman told me she'd prayed throughout the flight and that she knew we'd be safe. A businessman told me he thought he wouldn't see his family again, but that the way I communicated over the intercom gave him hope. Those conversations reminded me why I chose this profession. It's not just about flying planes or completing routes. It's about the responsibility of caring for hundreds of lives, making split-second decisions that can change everything, being the last line of defense when the unexpected happens. And the unexpected happens more than people imagine. Aviation is incredibly safe because of decades of learning, constant improvements, rigorous training. But it will never be 100% predictable. Nature, machines, even us humans, we're imperfect. What keeps us safe is preparation, experience, and the unwavering will to fight until the last second. I returned to flying a few weeks later, after undergoing psychological evaluation and a rest period. I won't lie, the first time I entered a cockpit again, I felt a chill. Memories of that night were vivid, almost as if I could hear the alarms again. But as the aircraft took off and climbed to cruise altitude, and everything was working perfectly, I felt I was in the right place. This is my calling, and I wouldn't let a traumatic experience, however intense it was, keep me from it. The story of the flight that faced the storm over the Atlantic spread through the aviation community. Other pilots sought me out, wanting to know details, understand how I made certain decisions, learn from what happened. I participated in talks at aviation schools, shared my experience at air safety seminars. If something good can come from such a dangerous situation, it's learning. Each incident, each emergency, contributes to a collective knowledge database that helps prevent future problems and better prepare the professionals who will come. Today, when I look back, I see that night not just as a terrifying event, but as a transformation point in my life and career. I learned about my own limits, about the importance of teamwork. Mike was fundamental that night. Without him, I don't know if we would have made it. And about the human capacity to overcome seemingly impossible situations. The passengers' trust, even without knowing all the details of what we were facing, is something I carry with me. They boarded that plane believing they'd reach their destination safely, and it was my responsibility to honor that trust. And we honored it. Each of those 367 passengers was able to return to their homes, to their families, to their lives. For many, it was just a flight with problems, a story to tell. But for Mike and me, it was the night we were tested to the limit and proved not to others, but to ourselves that we could face the worst and still prevail. If you're listening to me now and have flown before, know that there are extremely dedicated and trained professionals taking care of you up there. And if you've never flown or are afraid to fly, know that, despite stories like mine, aviation remains the safest means of transportation in the world. Each challenge faced makes the system more robust. Each lesson learned is incorporated into training and procedures. And if one day on a future flight you feel turbulence or hear the pilot announcing some problem, remember that we train for this our entire lives, and we'll do everything in our power to bring you safely back to the ground. If you're enjoying this real story from the skies, hit the like button and subscribe to the Pitot channel so you don't miss the next episode. Sometimes when I look at the sky on a starry night, I think about how many aircraft are up there at that exact moment, transporting thousands of people through the skies, and I wonder how many pilots right now might be facing their own challenges, making critical decisions, fighting against adversity. The cockpit can be a lonely place, even with a first officer beside you, because in the end certain decisions fall on your shoulders alone. But it's also a place of immense responsibility and purpose. If you made it this far, I hope this story gave you a different perspective on what it means to fly, about the challenges we face and about the dedication of the professionals who work in aviation. And if you enjoyed this real story from the skies, subscribe to the Pitot channel. Leave your comment telling what you felt hearing this account. Share it with someone who also loves aviation or is curious about what happens up there. Because each story we share isn't just entertainment, it's a reminder that behind every flight, there are real people with fears, hopes, and an unwavering determination to do their job in the best way possible.